Good evening. I know you're probably wondering, message to my younger self, how much younger can I get, you know? So, a 21-year-old doing this topic is kind of, a little crazy. But, I got a little bit of wisdom, just a little bit, just learning from all the preaching and stuff that I've hung around throughout my life. The sermon being, Dear Younger Me, Trust in God's Timing. You think about that and you wonder, trust in God's timing. Every day in our life, we have something, we're always on time, no matter what, it never stops. So you think about that and you see, sometimes me and God's timing does not align. Life is full of unexpected seasons. Instead of striving to control, trust in God's plan. Find peace in His timing. Because no matter what you think or how you look at it, we're going to be on God's timing regardless. So you might as well go with the flow. You might as well. We'll look at some examples of people that don't, and it usually doesn't turn out too well. If you could write a letter to your younger self, what would you say? I recommend you, if not a little bit during the lesson, but probably after the lesson, write a letter to your younger self. Well, not to your younger self, but to your future self. Because, the title does say a message to your younger self, but right now, 20 years down the line, hopefully you're not the same person. Hopefully you are growing in your faith, you are growing in your life, not being the same. I think about that. If 20 years down the line, be like 41, my wife hopes that I'm not the same person that I am right now, I bet she hopes that I'm a little more mature, a little more, understanding, all that stuff, It's a young marriage, we're still learning each other and all that stuff. So I bet she hopes that I'll learn her a little more 20 years down the line, not the same person that I am today. One thing we got to realize that we got to acknowledge the natural desires to rush, fix, and figure everything out in our daily lives. A lot of times we like to rush, when it comes to jobs and stuff like that, we like to rush stuff, and sometimes it doesn't turn out perfectly. God's timing is rarely our timing, but it's always the right timing. A problem we have today is we don't know what time it is. We have to understand that there's a time and place for everything. People like to talk when it's not time to talk. People like to say things when it's not time to say things. People always say, oh, it's on my timing, but it's not. We're going to go to our main text tonight. It will be Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 11. I love this verse so much because, in our day and time, we don't know what time it is. And so I feel like this verse needs to be said throughout this whole entire world. It starts off by saying in verse 1, to everything there is a season. There's a time and purpose under the heaven. A time to be born, a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. A time to kill, a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace, a time to refrain from embracing. A time to get, a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to rend and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love, a time to hate. A time of war and a time of peace. What profit hath that worketh in there wherein he labored? I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in. A time to die. We see in multiple examples in the Bible of people rushing God's timing. Rushing God's timing only leads to further frustration. A few examples that we can think of somebody rushing God's timing and not turning out too well is obviously Abraham. When God had a plan for him, he had said that he was going to give him a son, and he ended up rushing, thinking that he could take things into his own hands. He ended up having a baby with his concubine, which wasn't the baby that Jesus' seed was not going to go through. But God always, his timing is always going to be on his own timing. So you realize that no matter what Abraham did, at the end of the day, God did what he needed to do. And so therefore, you realize that Sarah, she was, I can't remember the age exactly, but it was close to 100 years old. At that time, it's usually not, you probably would never have a baby, but unless it's, God's timing. So therefore, God miraculously let Abraham have a baby because he was on his time, God's timing. If you think about Saul, if you remember Saul, King Saul, he decided to rush things. I remember when it was Samuel, when he was coming to make sacrifices, and Saul decided to take things in his own hands. He decided to go ahead and do it himself. And this was really crazy to think about. And that ended up leading to God turning his back on him and ultimately leading to his death. If we look at the verse 2, it talks about there's a time to be born and a time to die. We're going to be looking side by side of a great example in the Bible, which would be Job. So I'll have you turning back and forth. But I look at Ecclesiastes chapter 2, and I kind of directly compare it to Job chapter 6, verses 8 through 13. Job chapter 6, verses 8 through 13. At this time, if you've never heard or read Job, he has been through stuff that you couldn't even imagine. He's been going through all these things that we'll end up talking about in a few minutes, but we'll read this and then we'll kind of backtrack and go to that. But it talks about in verse 8, oh, that I might have my request and that God would grant me things that I long for. At this time, he's talking about he desires death because at this time he has boils on his skin. All these things are happening. He has lost everybody. At this point, he thinks it would be easier just to die. If you go to verse 9, it says, even that it would please God to destroy me, that he would let loose his hand and cut me off. Then should I yet have comfort, yea, would harden myself in sorrow. Let him not spare, for I have not concealed the words of the Holy One. What is my strength that I should hope? What is my end that I should prolong my life? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is it the flesh of brass? Is it not my help in me? And is it wisdom driven quite from me? If we look at this, we've gone through multiple things in our life that we just wonder, why, God? Why is this happening to me? It would be best that I just leave my problems behind. But you see here in Job, he's just saying, why not die? I've lost everything. Why not die? But as we continue, we'll understand that even more as we continue. If we go back to Ecclesiastes, the next thing we talk about is there's a time to break down and a time to build up. This morning, Mr. Terry talked about, being in the military. They want to break you down to build you back up. Being in football, it's probably not as rigorous as it would to be in the military. But, when I first got there to South Carolina, they were like, we're going to have to break you down to build you back up. If you look at it as you're climbing a mountain and there's a boulder, you're going to have to break things down to just keep climbing. They try to break you literally. They bring you to the hardest stuff. They have us doing this thing. It's called walking press. It's absolutely horrible, by the way. I get flashbacks of it all the time. It's meant to break you down because a lot of stuff that they do, they don't expect you to pass, but it's how are you going to respond? Sorry, my iPad keeps turning off. As you keep on going down, there's a time to weep and there's a time to laugh. Sometimes you may experience both of these at the same time. Not really at the same time, but a little close together. When there's a time that you have lost a loved one, first comes the weeping, and then you start remembering just the good things that happened in their life and what brought you joy. You kind of laugh at like something funny they did in the past, and like this is an example of both of these kind of being around the same area. There's a time to mourn and a time to dance. And then you keep going, it goes, and there's a time to cast away stones and a time to gather. There's a time to cast away bad influences, and there's a time to come together and build up. If there's people that are dragging you down and people that are stopping you from being a better Christian, what do you think the best thing to do? If they're not going in the same direction as you, either there's usually a median in the middle of what right and left. If you are pulling against each other, you're probably going to hit the middle. And so if you go in different directions, sometimes you got to cut that string in between you to get to your right path. It's hard to say that because, people maybe somebody you grew up with. I've had to do that multiple times in my life. You grow up with somebody, best friends, maybe you were going in the right direction at one point, and then sometime they go on a different path, and sometimes you have to cut them off to be able to get to where you're going, and that's the ultimate goal, to get to heaven. A time to embrace and a time not to embrace. This also goes back to different times of different hardships. Not every time during your hardships are you able to embrace or want to be embraced. Sometimes you just want to be able to just sit down, kind of think about life. There's a time for these things. There's a time to get, and there's a time to lose. I think a problem that we have today is that we always want to get, never want to lose. But you have to realize that there's a time for everything. We want. But what about when we lose? Are we just going to curse God? Are we just going to say, God, why have you put me through this? When, if you look at it, our blessings are far, far beyond how much we lose. There's a time to keep, and there's a time to cast away. You could also use that in the same reference I just used. Sometimes it's time to keep friendships. It's time to cast them away. A time to talk and a time to be silent. We all have somebody in our life that needs to hear this verse. It's time to talk and it's time to be silent. Sometimes people go out and, we have freedom of speech. It's America, we fought for that. And so, but people kind of take that a little too far. It's like, they say stuff that they don't need to say. And usually it's on the internet or it's something that are on TV, people that people look up to. People say some crazy stuff. This is not just being said. We need to understand that these things are real because we often switch these words around. When we break down, when we need to break down, when we need to build up, we break down. When we need to keep, sometimes we need to cast away. These things kind of go back and forth. It's not always immediately. God's timing is not always immediately, but it's eventually. And this leads us to one of the best examples in the Bible, like I said, would be Job. We'll spend probably most of the remainder of our time in Job, but I want you to keep these verses in the back of your head because we'll be looking at Job's life. Job, as I was writing this sermon, I was looking at this verse and I was like, how am I going to tie this all together? But then I started reading Job's life. He's literally almost experienced every single one of these times of seasons in a span of these, I think it's 42 verses. So we'll go to Job chapter 1, and we'll spend most of the remainder of our time here. I'll read it. It says, there was a man of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright and one that feared God and eschewed evil. And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels, and 500 yokes of oxen and 500 donkeys. And it was a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the east. And his sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his day. and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And it was so, when this day of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sacrificed a sacrifice in them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned, and cursed God in their hearts." Thus did Job continually. Seeing what Job will go through in the book, it's hard to see that he'll end up better than he left off. It's kind of crazy, writing these sermons. The first point and the last point are basically the same thing, Her first point is that he prospered. Job wasn't just, I barely have anything, I'm barely scraping by. He was the best in the East. Not only did he prosper, but as you've seen, and it talked about, that he was an upright and perfect man. We should all strive to be this. When we tend to have riches, it's easy to be able to say, forget God, I have what I need. I have all my worldly pleasures and stuff like that. But Job was considered an upright and perfect man, even with all the riches that he had. Spoiler alert, you turn to Job chapter 42, verses 12 through 17. How it ended even more. After he endured God's challenges, he ended up with even more. We'll just kind of skip over that, and we'll go towards the end of the lesson, just to kind of buy time. Job was considered a perfect man, but we aren't him. We make mistakes. So when we write this letter to our future selves, we need to strive for perfection and see the difference from you that you are today, 20 years down the line. So when I encouraged you to write these letters, 20 years down the line, you want to be able to mark down this list of things that you wanted to change and say that I've made that change. Our next point will be in Job chapter 1, verses 13 through 22. He suffered. This is when we start seeing all the things that had happened to Job. It'll kind of explain the verse that we read in chapter 3. If you start in verse 13, it says, "And there was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house. And there came a messenger unto Job and said, The oxen were plowing, and the donkeys were feeding beside them. And the Sabines fell upon them and took them away, yea, that they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword. And only am I to escape alone to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, The fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them, and only I have alone to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, there come also another, and said, The Chaldeans made out 3 bands, and fell upon the camel, and have carried them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only to escape alone to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, Thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a wind from the wilderness, and smote the 4 corners of the house, and fell upon the young men, and they are dead. And I alone only escaped to tell thee. Then Job arose and rent his mantle, and shaved his head, and fell down on the ground and worshipped, and said, Naked I came out my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. You read what we just read, and you kind of put yourself in that perspective. 4 times somebody came and told them that he has lost something. Not only did he lose all this materialistic stuff, all the camels, all the wealth, He lost his family. He lost his daughters. He lost his son. And if you read it, you read in verse 21, out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. He's still blessed. He's still praising the Lord. He understands that there is a season. He understands that there was a time to get, and there's time to take away. Job seemed to understand what was being said in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 6. There's a time to get, and there's a time to lose. This shows that Job trusted God's timing, even if he didn't understand why it was happening. Through all the suffering, would you be able to still trust in God? That's a question that you have to ask yourself. Because, when we were younger, we were like, we'd always, picture, if I was in Peter's footsteps, and I was Peter, and God asked me all this stuff, I would have been right beside him. I wouldn't have denied him and stuff like that, because we were big and tough and all that stuff like that. But you realize, if you were put in a situation like that when your life is on the line and you were going to have to go through what Christ went through, you might deny him too. You're not the big superhero. They were with Christ all the time. And you realize that, you might be in that same situation. We need to go down to Job chapter 19, verses 25. And we see, I'll kind of give you a little backstory since we're kind of skipping over. Job is going through everything. Job, like we said, Job is cursing the day he's born. Job's friends come to kind of gather around him and give him some comfort. They sat in silence for 3 days. That's another example of a time and place and a season. The time to talk, it's the time to be quiet. They understand that he was hurting. They understood that he probably just needed somebody's presence. And so they sat there with him for 3 days without saying a word. And if you continue, his friends are giving him advice, some good, some bad. And, they're asking him, why are you living? What have you done to cause all this? At the beginning, the reason why all this is happening, because, the devil came up, and they were having a meeting. They talk about this in the verse 6. And they were having a meeting, and the devil was asking if he could tempt Job. And so all this come about not from Job sinning, but it ended up coming about because the devil wanted to tempt Job. And so he's putting him all through these hardships. And so we see after all this, his friends are asking him, what did you do? You had to do something for God to do this to you. Job couldn't think of anything that he's done. Like we said in the first chapter, he was perfect and upright throughout his days. That leads us to our third point. He hoped in the Lord. Job believes that God will eventually make things right, even if it's not immediately. He was on God's timing. If you go to Job chapter 19, verses 25, he says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. He hoped in the Lord. He didn't see the Lord. He didn't see him face to face, but he knew he was there. That's hard for us to see. We go through a lot of stuff in life. I've seen people completely give up on God just because they lost somebody. They were like, oh, God couldn't let this happen, but God also gave us free will. And so sometimes things happen because other people have free will. He still hoped in the Lord, even after all these things. He trusted in the restoration would come to God's perfect timing, not his own. When you barely see the light at the end of the tunnel, will you be able to hope in him? Sometimes we may find ourselves questioning God. When we go through adversity, people tend to question him. God's really there. God gives us challenges to test our faith. You can find that in James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. You don't have to turn through it, but I'll kind of paraphrase it. You think that this is wrong? Oh, sorry. I will have to turn to that. Thought I wrote it down. Sorry. Go to James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. It says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptation, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and endure, wanting nothing, entire and wanting nothing." You read this, and you're like, isn't that kind of unjust? Why is he throwing stuff in our way when he wants us to remain faithful? But then you see this, and you think about it, and you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 13, and you read this verse, and it says, "There have no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it." Like I said, there's a time to break down and there's a time to build up. But like God, when he challenges us, kind of breaking us down so we come back a little stronger. But like it said in this verse 13, God doesn't give us a challenge that we can't handle. He knows each and every one of us better than we know ourselves. So when he gives you a challenge and you're like, "God, why did you give me this? There's no way I could have got out of this. You know my weaknesses." God's testing you. God knows that you can get through it. So you have to think about that when you go through hardships and when you go through things that have tempted you, because we all are tempted, and we all have our own individual things that, are a little harder than others. But just remember this verse 13. If our fourth point is he remained faithful. For many chapters, Job cried out in confusion and grief. He asked God why, but gets no immediate answer. Still, he refuses to give up on his faith. I look at this and I realize that is crazy. After all this, he still refuses to believe, to give up on God. He knows he's there. He knows that there's something, God's timing. He knows that God will eventually bless him again. Job believes that God eventually will make things right, even if not immediately. If you go to Job chapter 19, I'm going backwards. Job chapter 13, verses 15, that's what it was. "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him." And then we go to Ecclesiastes chapter 6, verses 13 through 14. "Consider the work of God, for who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful. But in the day of adversity, consider, God also hath set one over against the other, to the end that man should find nothing after him." This verse is very powerful, because in the day of prosperity, be joyful. But that second part, but in the day of adversity, consider, God has set the one over against the other. Like I said, we'll be joyful in prosperity, but when stuff starts going bad, that's when we tend to lose God. You can continue to get blessings and be like, "Thank you, God. I'm praying, I'm thanking you." But do you pray when your times are rough, or do you only pray when you get something? This reflects deep trust in God's timing, even in silence and suffering. In Psalm chapter 30, verses 5, this is a great verse to keep probably on your wall or something. Through hardships, weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. That verse is so powerful. Because yet you may be struggling today, there's something new tomorrow. Our fifth point is receiving restoration. We did a whole 360 because at the beginning, our first point, we talked about how much he had. But if we go in Job 42, verses 10 through 17, at the very end of the book, we'll read, Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withheld from thee. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore have I uttered that I understand not, things too wonderful for me which I knew not. Hear, I beseech thee, and I will speak, and I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. Sorry, I'm reading verse 1 through 3, sorry. In verse 10, it talks about, And the Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. Also the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then came there unto him all his brethren, and all his sisters, and all they that had been of his acquaintances before, and did eat bread with him in the house. And they bemoaned him and comforted him over all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. Every man also gave him a piece of money, and every one an earring of gold. So the Lord blessed the latter in the end of Job more than his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep and 6,000 camels, and 1,000 yoke of oxen and 1,000 donkeys. He had also 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he called the name of the first. We're going to kind of skip past this for time. In verse 14. And in all the land were no woman found so fair as the daughters of Job, and their father gave them inheritance among their brethren. After this lived Job 140 years, and saw his sons and daughters, sons even 4 generations. So Job died, being an old and full of days. At the end, God restored Job's fortune, blessing him with more than he had before. That came after a long session of testing. His story shows how trusting God's timing brings eventually healing and purpose. We see that there's another example of Ecclesiastes chapter 3, that they came and bemoaned him. There's a time to mourn, and there's time to dance. Kind of did a little both to celebrate. But if, towards the end, if I could write to my younger self, I would tell him over and over, trust God's timing. Life will throw seasons of joy, seasons of pain, seasons of waiting, and seasons of growth. And you'll be tempted to rush through them, to force answers, or to give up when it feels like God is silent. But remember, what Ecclesiastes reminds us, to everything there is a season. God is not random. God is not late. God is not careless. He is perfectly on time, working out his purpose in ways we may not see right away. Think about it. Job prospered. He suffered. He hoped. He remained faithful. And in the end, God restored him beyond what he could have imagined. Job's story shows that God's timing is what we need. Though often a mystery and always good, maybe today you're in a season of waiting or confusion. or deep grief. Maybe you feel like night is never going to end. But take to heart, weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. So instead of trying to control what you cannot control, release it. Instead of trying to fix what God can only fix, trust in him instead of striving. Rest in his faithfulness. God is writing your story in his perfect time, just as he did for Job, just as he did for countless others, just as he will do for you. Dear younger me, trust God's timing. It is worth it every single time. If you have not yet obeyed the gospel, there's 5 steps to salvation. You first have to hear, and you can find that in Romans chapter 10, verses 17. Then you have to believe, John 8:24. And then you have to repent, Luke 13:3. Confess, Matthew chapter 10, verses 32 and 33. Be baptized, Acts chapter 22, verses 16. Live faithful, Revelation chapter 2, verses 10. If you have not yet obeyed the gospel,